All right, everybody, let's do this. I'm Stephanie Bree. Today we're talking about the motherfucking Simpsons. I've been putting this off for a very long time, partially because this is the show that never fucking ends. Also, partially because I'm going to be honest with you. I am a fan of The Simpsons, actually, despite my previous assertions that I'm not a big fan of cartoons. There are a handful of animated television programs that I do enjoy. I've repeatedly stated this, and The Simpsons is one of them. But I'm not a fan of The Simpsons animated television show. I was a fan of The Simpsons comic books, the Bongo comics specifically. Also, The Simpsons video games, yes, even Bart versus the World on the NES, Bart versus the Space Mutants on the Sega Genesis, etc. So to me, I'm a fan of The Simpsons as characters. I am a fan of Springfield as a setting, the people in Springfield, the small town, and a lot of the tropes that go into it. Um, there's a few things I'm not a fan of. Now, I'm okay with political satire in my television shows. I've talked about this a little bit elsewhere. I try to avoid politics for a lot of reasons. This used to be a very political YouTube channel when I first started because I was a journalist and I was doing a newscast, a transgender focused newscast. So it was very political. So my political leanings are obviously pretty much to the left of center. So we don't need to get into the specifics, just that I'm okay with the satire. However, as I've also stated elsewhere repeatedly, I'm not a tremendous fan of comedy. Now, my favorite animated program or cartoon, if you will, of all time is Daria. And I don't think that's ever going to change just because of nostalgia. Um, and that is very much a satire. When it comes to films and television shows, satire is not my favorite type of comedy. I prefer screwball comedy and sometimes slapstick, but I can put up with satire. Now, sidebar, just so you can gauge where I'm going to go with this on The Simpsons. I am not a fan of Family Guy, like at all, or any of its spin-offs or cousins or Bob's Burgers or none of that. I don't like any of those shows. I did not like King of the Hill. I did not like Beavis and Butthead. So that'll kind of give you an idea where I fall on some of this. So The Simpsons. Um, we actually watched it. So let's go back to the beginning. We weren't watching the Tracy Ullman show because we didn't have cable that long ago, and that was a cable. That was a program that came on a cable network. I don't remember if it was HBO or Showtime or Cinemax, which it was one of the cable channels we didn't get. You got to remember, cable was still fairly new in the 80s, and the Fox network just launched. I mean, it was brand new. And The Simpsons was one of the first programs that launched with the Fox network. So for us, as a, low income family living in a very small town, under 1,000 people, probably about 600 or 700 people at the time, a third of that now. That town is dead. It is dead now. It's a ghost town. But that's what I was living in at the time. And so we didn't have cable, we just had the antenna. So to go from three networks plus PBS, all of a sudden we had a fourth network was a big deal to us. It was like finally something new to watch. And we latched on to Fox because it was different. So we, as a family, my mom, my dad, my sisters, and myself, we watched The Simpsons as a family. We watched Married with Children as a family, Cops as a family. So we, and then we would watch some of the I don't remember, I think it was Sally Jesse Raphael was there, Jerry Springer at the time. And then there were other shows. So we were like fucking happy to have something new to watch. Before we eventually got cable, and then it was like our eyes were opened. It was like, holy shit, a whole new world. Like we could just watch TV all day long. Up to that point, it was like, well, during the day, you've got infomercials and talk shows and soap operas, boring. In the evening, the early evening, you got the news, the local news, boring. You're talking to a kid here. And then you've got the primetime TV shows, you know, the network shows, which start off with game shows, you know, the Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, etc. And then it shifts into the sitcoms and the crime dramas and those things. And then you get the evening news and then the late night shows. So that's what television was like, broadcast TV was like at the time. The Simpsons was a whole new thing. It was the first time that networks had done an adult, family focused animated sitcom since the Flintstones. Um, Up to that point, cartoons had been relegated to Saturday mornings kids programming. So I do remember watching the pilot, the Christmas special, where they get the dog and they go to the racetrack and all that shit. You know, that very first, and it was like, here's our new show, check it out, what do you think? And everyone was like, holy shit, this is awesome. And I was one of those people. And it blew up overnight. Like, by the time the first season was airing regularly, they already had toys and video games like that fast. It was just like boom. One day there was no such thing as The Simpsons, and the next thing we had fucking Simpsons everywhere. It just literally blew up overnight. So I do remember getting some of they were like, I don't want to say plush dolls, because they weren't plush, they were rubber. But they were like rubber dolls. They weren't even really action figures. They were just little, like, I guess maybe PVC figurines of The Simpsons. Everybody had them. I had Bart, and I had Lisa, and I had the baby, Maggie. And that was it. And each of my friends had different ones. And I think there might have been a fast food like McDonald's or Burger King or something promotion tie-in. I'm not 100% on that. But I do remember, like, right after it came out, there was the video game. The first one was Bart versus the World on the NES, and that was followed up with Bart versus the Space Mutants, which was also on the NES, but then there was the Genesis version, which I would get years later. And then it was just like every other year there was a new Simpsons game. It was just like that fast. It was like a staple that fast. I don't know when the comics started, but I started reading the comics. I started with the Radioactive Man. I like my first Simpson comic was a Radioactive Man comic because I was more into that. And then there was one of the where Bart's a super. I think it's Bartman, something like that. So those were the ones I was more into. And then I didn't buy them regularly because they weren't back then. Comic book shops existed. Amazon didn't exist yet. But you buy your comic books at the local, at the grocery store, at the magazine stand, or at the convenience store. Again, at the magazine stand. So I bought my comic books at the local gas station, is where they sold comic books back then. And so they mostly had like this little spin, you know, like those little spindles, you know, where you got four sides and you rotate it around, and it's got like, you know, DC Comics here, Marvel Comics here, and then like Archie Comics, and then like everything else. So they didn't really, the Simpsons comics weren't really sold in those capacities. So it was like you could get Spider-Man, you could get Superman, you could get Batman, but you weren't going to get, you could get Archie, but you weren't going to get the Simpsons comics at that gas station. So we as a family watched every week. The new episode of The Simpsons came out. We watched it regularly as a family every week until 1993. Now, what happened in 93? Well, two things happened in 1993. The first thing that happened was my mom got a job working at she had previously been working at a bus factory with my dad. They both worked at the same factory. The factory moved towns, and when the factory moved towns, my dad's job moved with it. So my dad moved towns, so we moved as a family to go where his job went. But mom left, and I don't know why, and I've never asked. She went to work at a truck stop. Well, what happened was dad was working the day shift. Mom was working the graveyard shift. So we couldn't sit down and watch television as a family anymore. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was when I was in school, when I was in like kindergarten, first grade, my I was in therapy and I was in special ed and I was in physical therapy. And the school, the one of the therapists had determined that I had a handicap and I was needing to further develop my fine motor skills and hand-eye coordination. So they told my parents to let me play more video games. So I got a doctor's note to play video games. So what my parents did was they put a television in my bedroom and they put the NES that had been the family NES in the living room in my bedroom. Now I had to share it with my sisters. If they knocked on my door and I wasn't doing anything, they were allowed to come in and play, but they often didn't because we didn't have a lot of games for it. And the games we had weren't very good. We had Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt. We had that. But we had like Friday the 13th and this weird Japanese game I've never seen anybody talk about ever online, ever. So it was like, okay, weird. So we didn't have a lot. We would occasionally rent games from the local video store or the local. We had a grocery store called Bogarts that rented video games. We would rent from them, the grocery store. But we didn't really we didn't have a dedicated video rental store, and we didn't own a lot of games. So the reason why this is important is once my parents gave me a television and put it in my bedroom and gave me the NES, I was not inclined to go sit in the living room with my family and watch whatever they were watching as a family. And so with my sisters now, mom's asleep because she's got to work at graveyard. Dad is cooking supper because he's got to do mom's chores because mom's asleep. My sisters were now in charge of the television. So they were watching Blossom and Step by Step and Full House and more stereotypically female focused or female centered um, television sitcoms that didn't interest me as much. Um, and so we weren't sitting around watching as a family anymore. So I lost interest in The Simpsons because I was now sitting in my bedroom watching my own television channels, or playing video games, and I wasn't like socializing with the family. I was just like I was in my room. And then my parents got my sisters their own TV, and I got the NES, they got a VCR, which my parents said was only fair. So they would rent movies from the video store. They would get to watch videotapes in the bedroom, and I had the NES. I would get to rent video games, NES games in my bedroom. So that's what happened. So I didn't watch The Simpsons starting around 1993. I just stopped watching. I don't know what season that was or what storyline it was. I didn't stop watching for editorial reasons or the show wasn't good anymore. It wasn't funny anymore. It was just, life, my, events in my life changed to where it was no longer ideal to just sit down and watch The Simpsons. Occasionally, whatever day The Simpsons came on, I think it was Sundays. I'm not sure. Whatever day The Simpsons came on, sometimes I would, in between playing video games or playing with my toys or reading comic books, I would turn the TV on and I'd turn the knob and flip through the channels. And occasionally I would see an episode of The Simpsons on and I would sit and watch it. Now, my parents stayed fans of the show longer than I did. Um, so what my dad was doing is because, like I said, now we had a VCR, and a video store did open a dedicated video store did open up in town, and so we had a rental store so we could rent movies more frequently. So my sisters had their VCR in their bedroom, and then we had the VCR in the living room, so we now had two VCRs in the house. And so my dad started first renting and then buying uh, video cassettes of random episodes of The Simpsons. So we had an assortment of random Simpsons episodes, just fucking random episodes that we would pop in and watch occasionally as a family whenever the stars aligned and we all got together as a family, which wasn't very often because, like I said, mom was working graveyard, dad was working day shift, and me and my sisters weren't getting along at this time. So this was also um, around the time I started really realizing that I was trans. So I would lock myself in my room and try on, girls' clothes and play with sneak the, Rainbow Bright dolls into my bedroom and play with those. So I was exploring, feminine stuff on my own, but I was like scared of my family finding out. So I would, keep the door locked and have the radio going loud enough that people would leave me alone and also not hear what I was doing. So I again lost interest in The Simpsons, but I did discover the comic books and I started reading those on occasion. Now we moved a few more times and eventually we moved to a bigger town, a town that did have a dedicated comic book shop. But by this time, I was really heavily into X-Men comics. And so I wasn't buying Simpsons comics at this time. I was buying X-Men comics. And I had been uh, loosely following Spider-Man, and then the Clone Saga started. And midway through the Clone Saga, I just stopped reading Spider-Man altogether, and I was done with it. And so I was looking for something new to read. Now, fast forward a few years, I'm an adult now. My sisters are all married, they've got families, and my sister's first husband, the one she had her kids with, was a big fan of The Simpsons when she first married him. Now, they got married young. He was 18, or no, he was 19, she was 18 when they got married, or something like that. Maybe he was 20. I don't know. But they got married young and started having kids like right the fuck away. So I would go hang out with them. And if it was whatever day The Simpsons came on, they would be watching The Simpsons. So I'd watch it with them. And I'd be a little lost because, while things hadn't changed too much, narratively speaking, time doesn't progress in The Simpsons, but things had changed, like the tone of the show had changed, the animation style had changed slightly. I did notice that, and just like it felt like a different show, and I was just like not having it. Now this was after Family Guy had already come on the scene and made a big splash, and King of the Hill. So I think what happened, and I'm not a big fan. I'm not. I don't know much about the behind the scenes, but my assumption is what happened is The Simpsons had to respond to those shows, so they had to adapt, and also South Park. So they probably had to adapt to be more, I guess, edgy or whatever, to be more in line with those shows. Is my guess of most likely what happened. Either way, whatever it was, I wasn't a fan of the tone. Now, I had kept playing video games up to this point. I did have Crazy Taxi. I had that on, I think, GameCube, or it might have been Dreamcast. My sister had a Dreamcast. I had a GameCube. I don't remember which one of us had which system we had Crazy Taxi on because I didn't play it because I didn't like it. But this was around the time I started really getting more into comic books and comic book collecting. And so I started looking for Simpsons comics. And again, I wasn't in a big city. We didn't have a very good comic book shop. So I wasn't like finding them. So I wasn't like seeking them out. I was just like, oh, if they had, I would look through their comic books, and if they, I would look for, I would, X-Men and, you know, Batman, and then mm, Archie, and then maybe Simpsons or whatever. But I never did find much. So I just sort of like, okay, whatever. I'm not that interested. I lost interest. And then Fox came out with a new animated sitcom, and it bounced around from network to network for a while. Canceled and then rebooted and canceled and rebooted. And this was Futurama. And I fell in love with Futurama from day one. Now, Futurama is behind the scenes produced by some of the same people involved in The Simpsons. And it has a very Simpsons feel. And there were references to The Simpsons, and I believe there was at least one or two possibly crossover episodes, if I'm not mistaken. Um, I just vaguely remember, but so I got into Futurama, and at this time, we had digital comics, and so I had subscribed to the three digital comics. We had Comixology, which I subscribed to. We had Marvel, whatever Marvel was called, and whatever DC was called. I think it was Marvel Unlimited, but it might have been something else before it was Marvel Unlimited. I can't remember. But anyways, it was digital comics now, and I saw I now they had Simpsons comics and they also had Futurama comics. So I started reading some of those. But I was also reading through the backlog of like, detective comics and action comics and, trying to go through the old X-Men comics and New Mutants and looking through browsing through some of the older, pre-clone Spider-Man comics and just browsing to see what else was out there. So I wasn't like reading a whole bunch of Simpsons. I was just like occasionally I would like, um, I got like 20 minutes to sit down and, flip through a Simpsons comic or two. So I would read a few and, they were good. They were entertaining. And then fast forward a few more years, the comic apps changed hands a few times, and then eventually Comixology wound up under the Amazon umbrella, and then it became a part of um, Kindle Unlimited, and then like just recently they shut it down altogether, which fucking sucks. So obviously my subscription ended, and I was just over it. I was like, you know what, I'm not following it anymore. But long before that happened, Bongo Comics went out of business and lost the Simpsons license, I guess. And so the Simpsons comics ended, the Futurama comics ended, and then Disney Plus came on the scene like 3 or 4 years ago, and bam, all of a sudden, every episode of The Simpsons is available on Disney Plus. Now, before I subscribed to Disney Plus, I bought the first two seasons of The Simpsons on DVD and I rewatched them. And my at the time my plan was to buy additional seasons of The Simpsons, but I got bogged down buying seasons of Futurama because I was enjoying that show more. And then Netflix did that Enchanted, I think it was called. It was basically Futurama slash The Simpsons in the Middle Ages or something like that. And I watched like the first season of that, and I was like, you know what? I'm just over it. By this time, I had already come to terms with I was not really ever a fan of cartoons, and I was slowly because I never really watched that many to begin with. There were a few I would like watch, because my friends were watching, like Digimon or whatever, uh, Family Guy, etc. Just because my friends did, so I'd either watch with my friends or just have something to talk about with my friends. Because at that time, I was a Nintendo gamer and my friends were all PlayStation gamers. So we couldn't really compare notes on video games because they were playing video games that weren't on the Nintendo console and I was playing video games that weren't on their PlayStation console. So we couldn't really talk about video games because we had nothing in common. So we had like Family Guy and stuff like that. As time went on, I grew distant to my friends, because I was leaning more into transitioning and becoming, Stephanie, and I was putting my old life behind me. And not all of my friends were on board with the change. So eventually, I ended up cutting ties with almost all of those people. And that meant I had no more reason to watch Family Guy or any of these shows. And I just realized I'm not into cartoons. And I tried to watch some of season 3 of The Simpsons on Disney Plus, you know, picking up where my DVD collection left off, and realized that I was not into it. And that's when I decided I was really only ever a passive fan to begin with and not even that big of a fan. I was more a fan of the property in general, like the individual characters and the aesthetic, but not the actual storylines or the character, like the personalities of the characters or what was happening on. on the episodes. And so where I am now today is I have a couple of Simpsons trade paperbacks that collect a bunch of Simpsons comics, and I might, and I still have those first two seasons on DVD. I might pick up a handful of some of the reprints or old, trade paperbacks of the Bongo comics, but that's going to be the extent of my Simpsons. I don't have any of the video games, and I have no interest in picking up any of the video games because they weren't that good to begin with. I just played them when I was a kid because that's what we had. And putting nostalgia aside, those NES, Genesis, Simpsons games, they're not good games. So I have no reason to go back and replay them. So my stance today is I have no interest in The Simpsons. I'm over it. And I have no interest in going back. I have no interest in I don't have any interest currently in buying any of the action figures, although there is a toy line from the early 2000s, late 90s, 2000s, that I have a passive interest in. I might pick up a handful of toys from that toy line, like down the road after I get through some of my other collections more complete or, robust, and I decide to take a detour down that road. But I'm not there yet because I'm just like, nah, not that interested. So that's my um, experiences and thoughts on The Simpsons. So stay cool.